Hello and welcome everyone to this virtual ocean dialogue, strengthening ocean and community resilience to climate change. My name is Richard Black. I am the director of a small but pompously titled think tank in London called the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit. Previously, I worked for the Global Ocean Commission, and even going further back into the depths of history, I was a science and environment correspondent for the BBC. So it's great to be with you. I think there's no doubt that over the last few months, the oceans community has proved itself to be extremely resilient, because obviously many of you would have been otherwise in Lisbon at the UN Ocean Conference when that didn't happen. The WEF and Friends of the Ocean came together remarkably quickly to put forward this set of virtual dialogues, more than 50 events this week, a stunning array of speakers, amazing. So we're on the 5th day here. Perhaps fitting that we do look at something that has communities at the very heart of it. So the point of these dialogues is to bring together leaders from businesses, from governments, from civil society, scientists, discussing, sharing ideas for solutions. They're not, of course, a replacement for the UN Ocean Conference, but there is, of course, a hookup between them. But this is as much about you as it is about the 4 fantastic panelists that we've got for you today. And so we very much want to have your input so that we can feed it to the panelists and have a discussion around that. Your input is being taken for this session via Slido, the app Slido. So if you've already got that on your phone and you've been with these dialogues all week, you probably know exactly what to do. But if not, you need to go to slido.com, enter the event code #OceanDialogues. And basically the first thing that we're going to do with that is in the next few minutes, as we watch a video from the President of Costa Rica, which we'll be going to in just a second, please give your one-word answer to this question. What does ocean resilience mean to you? The question you can see on the screen before you. What does ocean resilience mean to you? And please do limit it to one word, because what we're going to do is, well, what Slido is going to do is going to agglomerate your responses into a word cloud, and then we're going to use this for the basis of our discussion when we come back. So while you're doing that, also please open your eyes and ears, if you would, to the welcoming message that we have now from Carlos Alvarado Quesada, who's the President of Costa Rica.
Today, we're celebrating an unusual World Environment Day, facing a pandemic that has exposed social inequalities and unprecedented challenges, but that also has shown the great potential of humankind to work together to overcome a crisis and build a sustainable future, leaving no one behind. The crisis surely will pass. However, the lessons we have learned should help us to deal with climate change, our biggest crisis ever, demanding urgent actions. I welcome the opportunity to talk about hope and the solutions nature offers to protect us from climate change impacts and to build resilient communities. Costa Rica is leading, together with France, the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People, which is a group of countries established to achieve an ambitious deal at the 15th Conference of Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity. The central goal of the coalition is to protect 30% of the planet, meaning both 30% of land and 30% of the ocean by 2030. Also, the coalition aims to unlock the full potential of nature in climate actions by promoting nature-based solutions within the UNFCCC. The coalition also promotes the integral role that additional terrestrial and marine protection will play in any strategy to successfully achieve the Paris Agreement goals. Costa Rica has historically been a leader in conservation. We have successfully doubled the forest coverage in the last 30 years, and with our decarbonization plan, we are pursuing a fossil fuel-free economy by 2050. What we did in land, we must now do at the ocean. Costa Rica is a country with a marine area 10 times bigger than its land. We recognize the importance of the ocean to sustain life in the planet and mitigate climate change impacts. Our coastal communities are the most affected with the impacts of climate change. Therefore, our communities will lead innovative and sustainable solutions like aquaculture, mangrove and coral reef restoration, and fisheries with higher value ensuring wealthy oceans. We are working towards a sustainable approach for ocean management. We are focused on developing marine spatial planning and effective networks of marine protected areas that highlight the benefits of healthy marine ecosystem to coastal communities. Costa Rica is also committed to promote a global blue economy transformation. We aim for an economy that recognizes the importance of healthy and resilient oceans. An economy that is aware of the total benefits provided by the ocean, including environmental services. An economy able to provide opportunities so that coastal communities share its benefits. An economy that confers high quality of life to people. To achieve this goal, we must work together and provide knowledge transfer among our countries and all stakeholders. We have to involve all sectors of the population, especially women and the youth. With the world currently facing an unparalleled health crisis intrinsically linked to our environment and the wildlife within it, we believe all international efforts to collaborate are more timely than ever. Any economic recovery plan should include sustainable and nature-positive initiatives. As we have said in this forum before, we must create policies that protect our ocean so the ocean can continue taking care of us. We better do it, and the time to do it is now. Today we're celebrating an unusual world environment.
Fantastic. Isn't it amazing that a president, the leader of a significant country, can take time out from dealing with coronavirus to send that message? An indication, I think, of how important, many world leaders feel this issue to be, know this issue to be. So for the next hour or so, we're going to be in the company of four fantastic panelists. And first of all, we want to have a look at your responses to that Slido question, because we're going to use that to sort of kick off the discussion. So there we are. There is your set of answers with health right at the middle, sustainability, biodiversity, diversity, life, future, prosperity, featuring very large in this as well. So let me introduce briefly the four panelists who we have. We have joining us from California at some unearthly hour in the morning, Dr. Fiorenza Micheli, co-director of the Center for Ocean Solutions at Stanford University, a scientist by background. Jennifer Morris, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Nature Conservancy, joining us from DC at not quite so awful an hour in the morning, but still pretty early. So thanks for that. Catherine Garrett Cox, who's the CEO of the Gulf International Bank Limited in UK, also chairs the Clean Air Fund and CDP. And Dr. Karen Kemper, who's Global Director of Environment, Natural Resources and Blue Economy Global Practice at the World Bank. So Let me come to you, if I may, Fiorenza. We had nature at the very centre of that word cloud. That's obviously something that you've spent most of your working life. Are you encouraged or discouraged by what you see at the moment in terms of nature's resilience to the various threats that humanity is throwing at the ocean?
Good morning, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Richard, for the introduction. It's a real pleasure and honor to be in this panel and in the virtual dialogues. I'm concerned about the state of the oceans. Threats to the ocean from climate change, overfishing, pollution are escalating. In almost 60% of the oceans, these threats have been increasing over the past decades. In all the coastal waters of countries worldwide, these threats have been increasing, and that's particularly the case in subtropical and tropical regions, and for seagrass, mangroves, and coral reef ecosystem, which are seeing the greatest risk. These impacts are affecting oceans and people, both, and the many benefits that oceans provide. The good news is that oceans are showing tremendous resilience and recovery potential. And studies have shown that through habitat protection and species protection, improvements in fisheries management, pollution control, recoveries are occurring. And through studies, estimates tell us that within decades, many of these marine species and ecosystems might rebound if the stressors, especially associated with climate change, are removed. And then the other reason for optimism are that despite the current upheaval, there are bright spots, there are communities and ecosystems that are thriving. And this has to do with nature, which was your original question, particular environmental settings that foster resilience, that promote resilience, but often these bright spots don't occur in remote places with no people, but rather where people have actually organized to manage and support the ecosystems and the resources. So, definitely impacts are posing major challenges, but there are also hopeful trends.
What you were saying there about sort of there being bright spots, and particularly with interaction for communities, I think brings us on very nicely to Jennifer Morris of TNC, because that's one of the things that TNC does, isn't it? Work with local communities, find ways in which you can actually work with them to boost resilience. Might be interesting to hear about one or two of the success stories that you've had. I think you're still on mute, Jennifer.
I'm sorry.
That's it. That's better. We've got you now.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the invitation. Yes, absolutely. Communities are at the center of the work that Nature Conservancy does. I think that it's clear from the world stresses that we have right now, if we don't have a clear focus on supporting communities in their efforts to protect their own coastlines, that not only do those communities lose, but we all lose. And I would say that there's clear focus of this sector has to be on community resilience. 40% of human population live on coasts, and we have to be protecting these areas for them. So I'll give you a couple of examples of successes that the Nature Conservancy has had around the world, and it's really that ability to link those communities with international partners. I'll give you one example recently from the insurance sector. Last year, 2019, in Mexico, in Quintana Roo, we worked with the parametric insurance sector to look at the value of reefs around coastal areas in Mexico to actually help protect coastlines. And the tourism sector became very interested in this, as you can imagine. When big storms come through, those beaches can be eroded very quickly. So there was a fantastic collaboration between the tourism sector and the parametric insurance industry, which basically set up for the first time an insurance product for coastal resilience. So that, and one of the problems in these schemes is always it takes forever for the payments to actually start flowing. So the damage happens, And then you have to wait a long time to get your money back. And the communities are sitting there with a loss of livelihoods from loss of ecotourism, as well as, of course, damage to their local ecosystems where they rely on for fish and other things. So what this system does, which I'm particularly excited about, is for the first time set up an automatic payment. When storm surges get to a certain level, a Category 5 storm is coming, the insurance companies know that that's exactly when the insurance payments need to start kicking in, because they know there's going to be damage to those reefs and those ecosystems. So that connection between communities and the tourism, local tourism industry, local tourism sector, as well as with the global industry, is one example that I'm really excited about, and how the Nature Conservancy can connect the dots between community, regional business, as well as global industry. And now the trick is we need to replicate that around the world so it can scale.
It's fascinating to hear that. I remember back in, it must have been 12, 13 years ago, hearing about a similar sort of insurance project for farmers in Ethiopia from drought protection. At that point, I think that was the first such insurance policy set up anywhere in the world. So while this sort of scheme is really interesting, I guess that sort of difference of 13 years shows that it's not been terribly fast implementing it. And maybe this is there's something tied up here with the finance sector and bringing finance and sustainable business models into that, which is, Catherine Garrett-Cox, that very much the area that you're working in.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. And yes, hello. It's wonderful to be joining everybody today. I mean, I think that what I would say is I think the finance community has made significant progress over the past 10 to 15 years in really grasping both the potential and opportunities in terms of sustainable development. And I think that most importantly, there's also been significant investor demand, which is really, which has been a hugely important driving force. And I think it's been fantastic to see the way in which the finance community has both looked at both, financial returns and also the ability to make positive impact. I think the reality, though, when we come to talk about the oceans, is that to date, there has been relatively limited focus on sustainable and impact investments with a specific ocean focus. And in fact, there was a recent survey that Responsible Investor ran where only about 21% of investors said that they're actually targeting SDG 14 or life underwater. But, and there's always a but I think the really positive thing is that we think that's changing. So in the same survey, 9 out of 10 institutional investors actually said that they were interested in financing the sustainable ocean economy. And I think, there is definitely a way that we can achieve both a financial impact and a positive benefit for the communities in terms of resilience. I mean, I think one of the great things that this virtual ocean dialogue series has done is to really shine a light on the potential of the scale and size of the ocean economy, whether it's just the fact it's the 7th largest economy in the world, or most importantly, that the growth prospects of the blue economy are estimated to be about twice that of the land-based economy. So from a finance perspective, I guess what I would briefly offer is that, we see 3 big themes as being absolutely critical to enable the scaling of capital that will make a difference. And we can talk about this later on. But I think the first is really to have much better information and data. I mean, I think one of the key things that has driven investors towards this space over the past 10 to 15 years has been better data. I think the other thing that has clearly been a huge driving force has been engagement. This idea that finance can work with investors and with corporates, and most importantly with communities, to create those lasting solutions. And then I think the last key theme is we need to get scale. I mean, it's fantastic that we've seen one blue bond, the Seychelles issued in 2018, but one, it was still relatively small. So I think we heard from the president of Costa Rica, we have to collaborate, we have to innovate, we have to work together if we're going to solve the world's problems. And I think there's a huge opportunity for those of us who are ready to step up.
Yeah, thanks, Catherine. Interesting. We'll come back on some of that a bit later, I think. Karen Kemper, the word that's now pulled ahead of all the others in the word cloud from the audience here is sustainability. And of course, when we're talking about working with communities to help those communities become more resilient, there are, of course, a lot of different threats that those communities are facing in terms of the ocean: climate change, acidification, overfishing, etc., etc. So sustainability is not a unidimensional thing, is it? You have to be smart about how you put the money in, so that you don't sort of avoid, you know, inadvertently creating other problems or exacerbating other problems with that investment.
Yes, Richard. That's a really very good point, and I'm really happy that sustainability comes up as such a big word in the word cloud from the audience. And good morning and good afternoon and good evening to everyone for this very interesting session. We at the World Bank, one of the key things that is on our minds right now in the context actually of the COVID-19 crisis is a blue sustainable recovery. And that is where the sustainability aspect that all of us have been talking about for a long time becomes even more paramount than what we were thinking before. Because with the blue recovery, there will be a lot of funding, a lot of stimulus funding that will be pumped into economies worldwide. And also in developing countries specifically, we expect a very sharp downturn, bigger than the Great Recession actually. And with that, especially communities and poor communities are extra vulnerable. So how do we bring these two angles together? And when we think of oceans, then we have to see that the different stimulus activities that are undertaken, that they don't undermine long-term sustainabilities. For instance, in earlier recovery efforts in earlier economic crises, we have seen that people said, well, we want to help fisher folk because there's a downturn and there needs to be more fishing. But if you have more fishing in oceans that are already overfished, or they are at the top of sustainable fishing, if you incentivize that, then in the end you actually do not have a win for communities, because the original fisher communities might end up with less fish. So in this blue recovery, we need to have a blue lens, an ocean lens, where we say, okay, what is good for long-term sustainability of the oceans, while we help people to get back on their feet. One part is, as I said, is looking at fishing. How do you do that? How you get funding to fisher folk, and so that you, in the end, have a sustainable recovery there. The other one is regarding tourism. 80% of the world's tourism happens on the coasts. What does all of that mean now in a post-COVID era? And would one not need to focus much more on sustainable tourism along the coasts, where communities play a big role, both as stakeholders and shareholders and beneficiaries, as we go along with that. And with that, of course, in that entire context, we have to think of overall ocean health. None of this will work if we don't look at pollution angles also. And the other area is what do we look in terms of communities? How do we look at climate change and climate change adaptation? For instance, in the World Bank, we have the West Africa Adaptation and Climate Project, which looks at 17 African states, where there's both climate change and man-made issues on erosion along the coast. How can communities adapt? Small island states, how can we help continue to protect them? So all of this comes together, and for the blue recovery, it's a moment to reset and to think what we can learn from what we have been doing before, but how can we put a blue lens on all of these investments that are coming? And that is one of the things we are looking at very strongly.
I should just say to everyone in the audience here, we'd love to get your questions, your comments, your perspectives on what our four panelists are saying. The way to submit those is again via Slido. So please, if you haven't got your mobile phone queued up to do that, download the app, use the QR code, ping us your questions and your comments. Karen, I just wanted to come back on that point about the blue recovery, because of course this is the big opportunity of our times and something that President Quesada referred to as well. Now, I'm reading lots in newspapers about a green recovery and sectors such as energy and aviation. I'm not reading much about the blue recovery. That conversation presumably needs to come out in the open pretty quickly so that policymakers can actually start to act on it.
Yes, indeed. Now, of course, a green recovery in part to a large extent also is a blue recovery. As one of my colleagues said, it's sort of an aqua color, green and blue. And that is part, but then there is that particular ocean lens that sometimes is forgotten, and that is one of the reasons why we talk about that. Let me give you one example. People are, for instance, thinking about the spike of single-use plastics that is currently happening, which from a hygiene perspective makes a lot of sense. People need to protect themselves from transmission of the virus, but at the same time, it may very much exacerbate the issue of plastics that makes it into the oceans. So one of the things that one can do is one can look at such single issue items as beach cleanups. They make a lot of sense. But you also need to look at the waste management system that is behind it. So to really look at improving waste management systems and making them part of not only a green recovery, but saying that this is part of a blue recovery, because otherwise we may have even more polluting impacts on the oceans. That would be one of the lenses that we are working for to take and to build it in. So green recovery does not exclude the blue recovery, but the blue recovery is a step further.
Fiorenza Micheli, from your perspective as a scientist and a conservationist, what would you be wanting governments to do in terms of encouraging a blue recovery that is sustainable, and what things should they not be encouraging specifically? You're on mute, Fiorenza, sorry.
Sorry,
that's better.
I was on mute. So a commitment to ocean protection. The president of Palau was actually in the opening day for the virtual dialogue. He gave one of the comments, and the Republic of Palau has, just as of last January, established protection of 80% of its exclusive economic zone in a very large protected area. To support climate resilience, to support domestic fisheries and food security for Palau. And so these commitments, and the president of Costa Rica also was talking about similar commitments to their ocean. So that those commitments, especially in large ocean states, such as small island states and many coastal areas, can add up to significant support and for resilience in oceans. Also, placing communities, especially vulnerable communities, at the very center of policies and climate actions, and having inclusive policies that empower communities to respond are actions that can be taken at local to national scales.
I mean, the involvement of communities in this is essential, but it's potentially counterproductive as well, because you could come across a situation, as Karen was suggesting, where actually the drive was to simply increase economic activity. That could be the community's view. So how should people respond to a situation like that?
Yes, that could very well happen, and in fact does happen. There are counterexamples. For example, communities in Mexico and Chile and other Latin American countries have obtained exclusive access rights, and have organized in cooperatives. And for example, I have worked in Baja California, Mexico, in collaboration with NGOs and communities in this region, and the communities have concessions for local fisheries for periods of 20 years, which has created incentives to support their fisheries sustainably. And this has led to tremendous innovation and adaptation in response to climate. Hypox and deoxygenation and heat waves have led to some of the collapse of some of the fisheries and ecological impacts. And in response, the communities have diversified their fisheries, have established marine reserves, have invested in mariculture and integrated mariculture development, have included women in conservation and ecotourism initiatives, have invested in renewables, and importantly have collaborated with scientists and have developed a system of co-production of knowledge together with scientists and NGOs. And so these, again, are examples of how with strong institution, with the appropriate incentive, financing, like we were discussing in this panel, these positive feedbacks can be started and maintained.
Jennifer Morris, I know that TNC works with communities in different parts of the world. What do you do to make sure, and I guess it's going to be even more important in the next few months than ever before, what do you do to make sure that the community's voices are being heard, that they sort of co-design stuff with you and other international partners?
Yeah, thanks for that question. This is critical. I think, COVID has just accelerated so many of the inequities on our planet, as we all know, and that giving communities a voice in a way that's very inclusive and they're sitting at the table is something that the Nature Conservancy's done on the coastal side through a program called Fish Path. So basically working in 13 countries with a group of different stakeholders, but communities at the core, with the understanding, of course, that communities rely on coastal fisheries resources as well as reef resources and mangroves, et cetera, for their own livelihoods, making sure that their needs are met while we're talking to the larger fishing sector. So this is something that is a long process. Everyone works with communities knows this is not something that happens overnight. You have to build trust. And that's something that the Nature Conservancy and many other actors in this field spend a lot of their lives doing, is working in those communities, understanding what the lives of these fishers people are, how they work together, how they have challenges working together in terms of sharing natural resources, and how do we develop the right incentive packages to ensure that they will protect their own natural capital working together. And I think the interesting examples I've seen where this can work really well is when the fishermen themselves see the value of protection. And the amazing thing about marine ecosystems is their ability to rebound so fast if you just leave them alone, especially in coastal habitats. I've seen this all over the world in places like East Timor and of course Mexico and Belize and other places where the Nature Conservancy works. It's amazing to see that if you show fisher people who know these resources better than anyone, how if you just let this area alone and you work together to collectively stop fishing in an area, even in a period of 3 years, you can see complete rebound of certain coastal fishery ecosystems. So community knowledge and that indigenous knowledge is so central to success. And we have to listen to those voices and not only listen, but actually have them participate in the solution. They are the solution and they know that. Sometimes they just need to see that it can happen in a community next to them, or they can learn by that example and really replicate that success for their own livelihood. So communities are essential, and I'm really happy that this session is actually focused on that discussion.
Catherine Garrett-Cox, you're in the banking sector, and of course, private capital will have a major role to play in how the world responds to COVID-19, how we come out of that. Are you sort of changing what you do, how you look at sustainability in the light of COVID-19?
So it's a really good question. At GIB, and particularly in our asset management side, we've always had a real focus on mobilizing capital in support of sustainable development. So actually, what we're really doing now is thinking very long and hard about certain initiatives that we can actually accelerate on the back of the post-COVID necessity. And I think that one of the fears that I had was that, as everybody was dealing with the pandemic, issues around sustainability and sustainable finance, frankly, were going to be sort of put on the back burner. And it was great to see that word right in the middle of the Slido poll, because I think that we have to recognise that we've had a massive wake-up call across the globe through this crisis. I mean, there have been tragic implications. But it's all ultimately come down to health in many senses. So actually, perhaps this will cause people to think more broadly about, not only our own personal health, but the health of our planet, the health of our oceans, and how we can actually build a much better world. And so I think, sorry.
That was quite tantalising, Catherine. You said that you're thinking about some sort of changes that you might make, and any little tidbits you can give us about the ways in which you might be changing things, what those thoughts are.
Well, I wouldn't want to give away our state secrets, Richard. But we've been designing very specific ESG solutions within our business that can actually match off and can be tailored to very specific investor demands. And that means that we can actually look at oceans, we can look at health, we can look at climate, we can look at governance. So we effectively have built a big database, whereas in the past, I think people have just taken indices and effectively sort of applied lenses and screens over the top. We've taken the raw underlying data, and I'm incredibly proud of what the team have designed. But this means that you have to ever more in finance. You've got to be differentiated. You've got to offer something better. And the reality is, within the finance space, is people always want some sort of return. And I think the challenge of historically impact type investments has been that it's been very difficult to scale them. And I think maybe going back to what Karen was saying around the sort of rebuild of the economy, I absolutely would agree with her statement that green does encompass blue, but somehow we need to make sure that the light gets shone on the blue space as well. And how do we actually bring private sector capital to the market, to these solutions, so that communities are stronger, so that people understand the opportunities and the costs. So I think over the past few years, investors have really done a good job in mobilizing and working with companies. And there's actually a really great example in the UK here where, following a successful investor engagement campaign, Tesco actually moved to 100% of seafood from certifiable renewable resources. So I think, we have seen change. We can affect real change and difference, but it's how we get that intersection of both identifying the growth opportunities, but really putting them so that we can protect our oceans for the future benefit of the generations that will follow us.
Karen, would you like to respond to anything that Catherine was saying there? I mean, the challenge of getting private capital into these projects in a meaningful way, in a community involved way, does seem to be quite a big one.
Yes, actually, I'd like to pick up on one thing that Catherine said earlier also, with regard to blue bonds. We are very proudly associated with the Seychelles Blue Bond that we helped to bring to life jointly with many others, including TNC, and really to support the government of Seychelles when they wanted to show that one can do such a thing as the Blue Bond. But we would also like to see more blue bonds. We do think that there is a market around that, but perhaps it's a transaction cost related issue for countries, because there has also been a very active green bond market, and perhaps that has been perceived as easier by countries to rather issue green bonds than a more niche perceived product such as a blue bond. But just to give you an idea, the World Bank has been issuing themed bonds that relate to the SDGs. And one of those themed bonds is an ocean and water bond. And over the past 2 years, we've already issued $4.5 billion of these themed bonds. That has been done in 11 currencies and in over 35 transactions. Now, the interesting thing here is that investors come to the table because they have seen the importance of investing in ocean health, and to highlight the SDG around oceans. And so you see that there is an uptake. Now that is slightly different, or rather very different, from direct impact investment. And that is what Catherine was referring to. How do you go to scale with impact investments on oceans? And that is where there's a way to go. But the fact that we've been able to issue 4.5 billion around an oceans and water theme tells you how much investors worldwide are interested in the topic. And I think we all need to continue working on making this possible.
Of course, many organizations in many countries are at the moment talking to their governments and trying to persuade them to do this or that or the other thing. I mean, Jennifer Morris, we have, of course, some lessons from the previous economic crisis, 2008 and so on, and how different governments rebuilt out of that. If you were advising policymakers today about why they should take the blue economy seriously, why they should put money into that, what the returns are going to be into, you know, jobs and economic returns, what would you be telling them? What evidence would you be putting in front of them?
Well, the first thing I would address is the highly indebted nature of a lot of the countries that we're working in, especially in a post-COVID reality. I was on a call the other day with President Moreno, the outgoing president of the Inter-American Development Bank, and he was saying some countries in Latin America are now, because of COVID and all of the need to put government resources into health, they're looking at between 60, in some places they're going towards a 75% debt to GDP ratio. That is unsustainable. So how do we take that situation in government coffers and the highly indebted nature and work with capital markets, those creditors who actually have lent monies to those countries, when the reality is a lot of that money is not going to be repaid? Is there an opportunity to replicate debt for nature swaps like we did in the Seychelles, which is called a blue bond, but is really a debt for nature swap, and actually replicate the success there? That was several years ago now. Catherine mentioned it earlier. The ability to take advantage of the situation of these countries where they have high rates of debt and to invest it for a future blue resilient economy, working together with the international financial sector, I think is a tremendous opportunity where we can take the example there and actually replicate it. So the Nature Conservancy has a goal over the next 5 years to actually do this in 20 more countries, and countries are lining up. We're talking to many countries right now who are saying, please help us do this. You've done it once, we know we can do it again. The Tropical Forest Conservation Act as well, which is a sovereign debt facility in the United States, has included coastal ecosystems into its facility. So we're also looking at USAID debt and other types of sovereign debt, where that can also be swapped to invest in nature. And countries are saying, we will protect up to 30% of our coastal reserves if we can get access to these facilities, which will enable us to recover in a much more resilient way. So that is a very exciting thing, and that's what I would talk to governments about.
Fantastic. Now, we've been having a number of questions and comments come in already. A reminder, if you want to send something in, and you've probably got about 20 minutes at the outside to do so if you want to, it's on the Slido app. Jennifer, I think I'm going to come to you for the first of these questions, if I may. So this is from Nicholas Watts, and Nicholas asks, how do we support the direct transfer of positive experiences from one remote local community to others to help build trust faster?
That's a great question. So I think that, as I mentioned before in the examples of coastal fisheries, developing mechanisms for communities to document those ways in a compelling way, and then for organizations like nonprofits as well as governments to then take those examples, and even ideally, if financial resources are there, to take representatives from those areas to talk to other communities. It depends on, of course, where we're talking about, but develop powerful storytelling and showing by example. I mean, in my 23 years of experience of doing this work, the best way to have someone replicate is to actually show them, not to come and talk to them and show them nice, pretty brochures. You need to actually show them through video, have the fishermen themselves talk about what worked. That for me, it's not easy. There's no silver bullet for this, but I think we've come a long way in terms of the ability to tell stories and the ability to really use technology to share different examples of success around the world.
That's a wonderful answer. Catherine, Karen, Fionza, any of you like to come in and add some more brief comments to that? If not, yes, Fiorenza, yeah. You're still on mute, Fiorenza.
Yes.
That's better.
I think it's very important from a science perspective to also better understand what works where for whom, and continue to dive in the tremendous diversity of ecosystems and communities that are out there. There is the potential to perhaps develop some typologies of communities where certain solutions can actually work. And so that addressing the nuances and understanding what can be scaled, I think it's a priority for science as well as action.
There's a question come in that I'd like to put to you, Fiorenza, if I may. This comes from Sophie Zweifel. And Sophie asks, to what extent do you think our, in inverted commas, solutions for example, fish hatcheries could actually compound the problem? Are we better off trying to let nature do the kind of job of restoring rather than intervening in those ways?
It really depends. I think that again, it's where and how hatcheries are established and for what species and in what settings. For example, we were talking about marine reserves and marine protected area as a mechanism for resilience. Studies have shown there's now empirical evidence that protection, among other things, maintaining genetic diversity and habitat, also leads to larger animals. And those larger animals produce more youngs, and those to boost population and replenish. And so those are natural hatcheries. So in some cases, the investment in conservation might actually work best, just like it's suggested in the questions. But there are cases where we're beyond the tipping points for populations. And so that natural potential is no longer there. And then hatcheries can be a viable solution. So I would say that there's a lot of need for innovation and technologies and science around these questions.
Yes, of course, we're also working in a world where the needs of the biodiversity of the fisheries are not the only need in the game, are they? It is also the needs of people for livelihoods.
Very much so, yes.
Yeah. Karen, one perhaps for you, certainly initially, from Dr. MS. Are there up-to-date centralized guidelines in terms of providing expertise to local communities for sustainable business development? So again, this idea of experiences being shared from communities to other communities where they can be useful.
There are no centralized guidelines that I would be aware of. I would like to pick up on what Jennifer said earlier, however. People in general, communities, they like to learn from each other. And today we have the technology to really show what happened in one place and what could apply in another place. And people are so connected everywhere in the world, including in the developing world, that to see things on video or to interact with others in different places, that is not such an unusual thing anymore than it would have been even 10 years ago. So I think there's a lot of organizations that work in country or international organizations that have a good idea on how to work with communities and that can help facilitate that kind of exchanges. But centralized guidelines, every place is so different and has its own culture and its own unique issues that would perhaps people might not really need that. They need that exchange, that knowledge exchange.
Yes, we're in a very different sort of information world from where we were a decade ago, aren't we? Where actually people can often find themselves now. They find who they want to talk to themselves via various platforms and so on, rather than needing anyone to organise this stuff for them. Catherine, here's one for you. I think the person asking the question didn't give their name, but do you think we will see more regulation for the financial industry with regards to sustainability, especially with regard to water and oceans?
Well, I was actually going to say that I think that the TCFD disclosure, which has obviously been implemented pretty successfully, I would say, across the financial services sector, has had a very positive impact. And sometimes I don't know. I sometimes think that increased regulation and forcing people to do things can sometimes have unintended consequences. But in this case, I think it's been a huge help. And I think the leadership that we've seen from Mark Carney and the Financial Stability Board has led to people putting this at the top of their lists. So, I mean, I think that one of the surveys I looked at recently from the asset management sector would indicate that around 60% of asset managers globally are in the process of decarbonizing their portfolios. And people love to talk about the fact that, their carbon footprint, their carbon emissions will be X% less than the benchmark that they are looking to outperform. So I think that's really positive. This has been a relatively recent development, I would say, over the past few years. And I think the good thing about regulation is that it's been a very concerted effort across the globe, and we need to see more of it. So do I think we will specifically see regulation in terms of water and oceans and sustainability? I think I rather hope so, but I equally hope that people do it of their own accord, because this is just the right thing to do. And so rather than taking a sledgehammer to crack the proverbial nut, I actually think that people are very engaged on these topics. And so whether you do it, within a highly regulated environment or not, financial services sector is by its very nature regulated. But I think it will absolutely come, because we've benefited from the leadership that we've seen so far. And sometimes people just need to be persuaded in a slightly different way.
There's a tie-in here, of course, to this whole green recovery thing, because a number of organizations, including the Global Energy Transitions Commission, have put forward as one of their suggested principles for the recovery that basically if a company or corporation is not signed up to TCFD, then they don't get bailout money, which in some ways would seem to be a no-brainer, not only from the environmental point of view, but also from the fact that, it will be public money going to these things. And if a company is signed up to TCFD, then the investment is probably going to be more sustainable. Sorry to blather on slightly, but there was just something else I wanted to pick up from what you said, Catherine, in terms of companies and so on doing things themselves. A slight plug for something else that's happening today from a different branch of the United Nations, the United Nations Climate Convention, and a high-level champions for the UK and Chile, which is the launch of a Race to Zero campaign. Basically, the idea of getting companies, cities, regions and states to set net zero targets and work towards them, set plans towards them. So this is something in which my organization ECIU has been involved with bits of data. We've got new stuff out today showing that 53% of global GDP is now produced in countries, regions, cities that have set or said they will set a net zero target. And perhaps something that we might hear a little bit more if we're lucky from John Merton, who's the UK's COP26 envoy, who's going to give us some final remarks at the end of this session. And John's colleagues are, of course, involved in that launch. Whoa, okay, Catherine, I'm going to come back to you swiftly after that long monologue. Another anonymous question: how do we leverage largely untapped private sources of funding for ocean and marine conservation? I guess the question, assumes that there are large sums of money out there that aren't being tapped and which can be tapped.
I mean, I think it comes back to this point that I made at the very start of the session, Richard, which is really around, I think we have much better data now. And that, I think, has really led people to think about how they can put it to good use. 10, 15 years ago in the finance sector, this idea that you would seek a financial return and make an impact to something else was really just a non-conversation. And so the world has come a very long way relatively fast. But I think the post-COVID era will really require us to think about this. Now, I think ultimately one of the challenges around oceans and marine conservation has been the whole sort of risk participation side and how do you scale. So I think this is, again, back to one of the other observations I made was, I think the power of partnerships in these areas is going to be really critical. So historically, the finance industry tended to operate, in a relatively sort of vertical set of silos. I think it looks very, very different now. And so you've seen the power of these multi-stakeholder engagements. And actually just the very fact that we're even having this dialogue with the panelists that we've got would indicate that, we care about this. And so organizations and finance, financiers need to get a grip of this. So I think we need to look for examples and case studies where those big sort of deep private sector pots of cash and capital can be put to good use. I mean, there are some good examples around the world in terms of partnering with development banks, particularly, who can actually sort of help bridge some of that gap, and maybe we'll see more of it. But would I love to see more money invested in some of the areas that Karen spoke about? Absolutely, and I think they will come. They absolutely will come, and we very much want to be part of that at GIB.
Jennifer, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, can I just add something to that? So I think Catherine makes a great point on partnership, and but I would like to say that we need to do a much better job in our sector of stacking capital. There are lots of private philanthropists who would love to incentivize commercial actors to come in. And I think we look at these things in silos. We look at philanthropy over here, we look at public funding over here, and then we look at commercial return capital here. There have been examples, of course, when we bring that all together, and it works quite well. It's complicated, these structures often, and we get caught up in the sort of details and the complications. But the reality is, if we can put more of that money to work together and be, much more creative in how we bundle these things so that we're actually in, because the reality is, Catherine, as you know very well, a lot of the stuff that we're trying to do on the ocean is not commercially financeable yet. There's not going to be the returns that investors want to see at scale. They're going to get double-digit returns. It's just not there. So we have to be honest about that. And actually, I'm very supportive of impact capital, but I think what we really need to be doing is recognizing the returns aren't there and actually buying down that risk and buying down some of that return through philanthropic investments and public money as well, and creating this much more layered approach and creative approach to financing packages that will allow us to achieve results on the ocean and demonstrate to commercial investors that, slowly we're getting there. But right now we've got to de-risk these investments because it's just not commercially viable yet.
And can I just sort of hop in, just building on what Jennifer said? I mean, so it's this idea really of blended finance across the piece. And you're absolutely correct. I completely agree with you that, you know, some of these projects around sort of marine conservation and oceans, they're just not viable at the moment. But it's really interesting taking an example from the Clean Air Fund, where I'm chairing that philanthropic initiative, because we've really started to see the corporate sector engage around clean air and to think about how can they participate, finance, and really have a lasting impact around air quality and air pollution, which, you know, this is the natural world around us. I mean, we can call it what we like, whether it's oceans or green or air, but, you know, we are so dependent upon all of this for living. And I think it's this idea of we've got to share best practice and find these stories so we can connect, as you said, all the actors to really drive the scale that I think we need.
Just a few minutes we have left. I just want to pick up on a few of the other questions that have come in. Of all the words that were prominent in that word cloud, I think one that we actually haven't mentioned a lot is biodiversity. And we've got a question in here from Henry Duffy, perhaps for you, Fiorenza. How do we better connect biodiversity conservation and resilience, i.e., you know, benefits, links between healthy coral reefs, mangroves, and coastal storm protection?
Yes, healthy oceans, healthy ecosystems are key to resilient communities. So both through protection and restoration of mangroves and coral reefs, basically safer coastlines, and so they're all connected. It is key that we develop marine protected areas as cornerstone for human development and coastal economies, and showing those benefits and linking these investments to benefits for people is the path forward.
There's been a couple of questions on this concept of a blue recovery. There's questions in from Sue, who describes herself as an ordinary citizen, by which I take it to mean she's not you know, professionally engaged in ocean activities. And Sue says, it's the first time I've heard of blue recovery, and delighted to hear that collaboration is the way. How can it best be promoted? Karen, would you like to have a first go at that one?
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, one of the ways of promoting it is, of course, through fora like these. So I'm very glad, Sue, that you heard about blue recovery here. And at the same time, there are more and more large institutions that talk about blue recovery. So I do think that that is going to spread. Both at the level of countries, at entities like the European Commission, and I think we all at either in our different institutions or also ordinary citizens can talk about it and can ask about it. So what about the oceans? Okay, everybody's talking about sustainable recovery, a green recovery. Does that include oceans, or does it stop at the landline? So that is, I think, how everybody can work for that, and then of course also take action, be it related to, for instance, purchasing seafood that is certified, or avoiding single-use plastic in daily life where it is not needed. Again, the COVID situation has changed some of that, but other things one really doesn't need to do. So one can also do a lot in one's daily life in order to support that. And we are billions of people on this planet. So if many of us change our daily life, it will absolutely make an impact.
Now, I think we're very near the end of this slot, but I want to come to each of you, I may in turn, for a very quick last answer, and I would ask you to make it quick if you would. I'm just going to conflate a couple of questions. One from someone who didn't give their name. In your opinion, what is the most promising solution for building ocean resilience? And another question, audience member Sahir Rashid Baig asked what does success looks like in terms of green and blue recovery. So I guess the way to synthesize those is one thing that you would like to see but perhaps you think is essential that comes into place in the next few months in terms of post-COVID recovery and so on. Who would, Jennifer, would you like to, just because you're first on my screen, that's the only reason,
Sure.
would you like to go first on that?
I get the lucky first straw. The thing that I'm most excited about is what I mentioned before, honestly, is this ability to work with highly indebted nations to address some of their fiscal constraints and invest in nature. I think we need, private actors, creditors to step up. We need governments who are owed that money to step up and say, you know what, it's okay if you can't repay all of it. Why don't you invest in nature and in a blue recovery? So that's the thing that I think I'm most excited about and have the best opportunity.
Fantastic. Thank you. Catherine.
I think I'd be most excited to see a real mainstreaming of these issues. I think we've made great progress around the broad topic of climate change over the past few years, but to be able to mainstream a real focus around ocean resilience would be a big tick for me.
Fantastic. Firenze.
I'm most excited about the potential to form partnerships among communities, governments, academia, breaking down the silos, co-designing and deploying solutions. And this is what Center for Ocean Solutions is committed to.
Fantastic. And Karen, last word to you.
For me, it would be a scale up in blue finance in the various facets that we discussed today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for being so brief with that. So I'm now going to just thank Fiorenza Michele from the Center for Ocean Solutions, Jennifer Morris from TNC, Catherine Garrett-Cox from the Gulf International Bank, and Karin Kemper from the World Bank for being a fantastic panel today. And in the few minutes we have left, we have a special guest who's going to say a few words. And straight over to you, John Merton, the COP26 envoy for the UK presidency.
Thank you very much, Richard. I hope you can all hear me, and thank you very much to the panelists for that really stimulating discussion, which was so expertly chaired. I learned a lot and was delighted to be listening. It's very hard to follow a panel as strong as that, but I think what it does is you've given me certainly a huge piece of context for the work that we're undertaking as the UK presidency of COP26. We know that next year, 2021, is going to be a huge year for international efforts on climate change and biodiversity. We will see the 15th Conference of the Parties of the Conference on Biological Diversity in Kunming in China, somewhere in the middle of next year, and then in the autumn now we've confirmed dates for COP26 in November 2021. And the fact that these events have been postponed by COVID-19 raises a lot more challenges that the panelists have discussed, and how we handle green or blue stimulus, but also creates opportunities because it shifts it into a year where the presidency of the G7 and the G20 will be the UK and Italy, who are hosts to COP26. So it gives us the opportunity to build a very strong theme through the G7, through CBD15, through the G20, up to COP26, and make sure that the work that we do reflects a lot of the issues you've raised. Under Chile's presidency of COP25, they established this concept of a blue COP and a future ocean dialogue that we will be wanting to take forward as COP26 presidency. But as I think Karen said, blue is green in this regard, and more widely, a climate ambition at COP26 is going to be critical as the world comes together to take forward action to hold temperature rises to below 2 degrees and as close as possible to 1.5 degrees. This climate action that we'll be seeking to encourage at COP26 is ocean action, and it will help protect the ocean from further irreversible impacts of climate change. And we will be pushing over the next 18 months, all countries, all parties to the Paris Agreement to come forward with ambitious new NDCs that will help us meet our Paris goals. And as part of, alongside that work on NDCs, we'll be working through a number of campaigns in the run up to COP26, and two of them particularly touch on the discussion that we've had today. One is all about nature-based solutions, and I think earlier in this week you had our Minister Zach Goldsmith, come and speak about the importance of nature-based solutions in tackling climate change. And that's particularly true in the marine habitats as well. I think this session was organized by a friend, Christian Telecki, who I studied with at university. And even back then we were learning about the benefits of salt marshes to rural communities and mangrove swamps in terms of protecting from storm surges and so on. And so marine protected areas are evidently an important part of any nature-based solutions to tackling climate change. And I was interested by what Jennifer said in the discussion, and that one of the exciting things about a lot of this work in marine protected areas and nature-based solutions in a marine context is the speed of rebound, which is far greater than in terrestrial ecosystems. And so great as the challenge is, the progress we can make on this front is exciting. And it's exciting now how ideas that would have seemed sort of far-fetched years ago are now gaining, just a few years ago, are gaining rapid traction. And the fact that my UK government supports the protection of at least 30% of the global ocean within marine protected areas and is leading the way in terms of ocean protection, with 25% of UK waters now protected through MPAs is an exciting thing that we might not have anticipated even a few short years ago. And the UK's Blue Belt programme, I'm pleased to say, is on track to protect about 4 million square kilometres of ocean around the UK's overseas territories this year, and we'll be committing a lot of finance to that. Finance is key to a lot of the discussion, and it will be a secondary theme, another theme of our COP26 presidency. It's really important in terms of helping countries around the world deliver on their climate ambition that we meet our international climate finance goals, the 100 billion a year that we committed to at Paris. And I'm very conscious that as a result of COVID-19, international climate finance will come under a lot of pressure as donors struggle to make their commitments, and we'll be pushing countries to maintain their climate financing. And our Prime Minister has announced how we'll double ours to £11.6 billion from the period, the 5 years from 2021. It's really important that a lot of that climate finance goes not just to mitigation projects, but also to adaptation and resilience, including through nature-based solutions. And we've made the commitment from the UK that 50% of our climate financing will go to adaptation and resilience. But as has been pointed out by the panel, it can't just be public finance. We need private finance. It was great to hear Jennifer talk about insurance products to value coral reefs. A really good example of how we can sort of work to internalize the externalities of climate change into financial decision making. And we're working with Mark Carney on our finance stream ahead of COP26 to support this and address questions about how we get financial products to support climate change, how we get financial decision makers to factor climate change into their decision making. Karen Garrett-Cox spoke about the decarbonisation of assets. We're working very much in that regard, and in my work around the world, we speak to pension fund managers. If you speak to the head of the Japanese government pension fund, he controls 1% of global stock market assets. If you speak to the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, you've got another 1%. Pretty soon you're talking to quite large sums of money that can actually affect the way companies consider the environment in their decision making. And Richard mentioned the Race to Zero that gets launched today, which will be a part of that. Karen Kempter talked about the role of the MDBs in financing blue recovery. And it's really important that goes forward, that work, and that country managers on the ground are properly incentivized in that regard, because we're all conscious that at headquarters we can set out clear guidelines, but country managers in MDBs feel pressure to get money out of the door, just as country managers in aid programs feel pressure to get the money out of the door. And we've got to make sure that they're incentivized to make sure that the money that goes out is properly calibrated and in line with our blue recovery, our green recovery goals. And the UK's got a long way to go in that regard, and we're having an ongoing debate in the UK government about how we do that. And the point that was made, I think, by Jennifer about scaling up is important, because a lot of the transactions that would encourage a green recovery are often of a smaller scale than the sort of scale of transactions that organisations like UK Export Finance are used to supporting. So buying down the risk and scaling up green recovery programs will be a really important part of this. And I suppose finally, I'm conscious I don't want to speak for too long, Richard. One of the really important things as we go forward to next year, in an era where some countries are turning away from multilateral collaboration, the whole concept of blue recovery and oceans that connect us all shows the importance of multilateral cooperation. And the UK is very much committed to advancing multilateral cooperation in this sphere, and to supporting the idea of countries working together to common solutions on this sort of issue. The challenges are so great with regard to the oceans that we can't simply retreat from multilateralism, and actually processes like the UNFCCC and the Conference on Biological Diversity are really important in terms of helping us find solutions to the problems that we face. I'm happy to answer any questions, Richard.
Thanks so much, John. That's fantastic. COP26 may be a year late, but you were bang on time. So thank you. Thanks for that welcome reminder of how many exciting international events do lie ahead in the coming, well, whenever COVID allows them to happen, I think. So that's the end of this session now. Within 15 minutes, there's another set of sessions starting, the deep dives. It's particularly applicable, of course, when we're talking about ocean issues, to have deep dives, but there we are. There are 5 different sessions that you can join, but you get 15 minutes first to go away, have a cup of tea, have a bite, whatever you like. It's been, my point of view, it's been a really wonderful, enjoyable session. So thank you to WEF Friends of Ocean for putting this together, in particular Christian Teleki, Elena Perez, and all the rest of the technical team who've made things just go absolutely, if I can use another pun, swimmingly. Thank you so much for all of that. And Race to Zero, I think, has already started over on another channel. So have a great day all.